Hi everyone and welcome back to my vlog. Thank you for the support. For those who are new to the channel, my name is Joya and I mostly deal with Australian music content and old venues, interviews with musicians. And today the question I'm asking is, whatever happened to the Paris Theatre in Sydney? So first up, let's go on the hunt and see where the location is. This is Hyde Park. And I'm approaching the location where the Paris Theatre was. I do believe it's right in front of me here. So I have read that the Connaught is the site. It's a Sunday morning and there's still a lot of noise, traffic in Sydney. Hyde Park is across the road. I'll go further up and see if I can show a different angle. There's a corner of Wentworth Avenue and Liverpool Street right here. And it would have been a great venue. Nice park across the road here. Next to the Connaught apartment block, so there's a location there. So the Paris Theatre began its life as the Australia Picture Palace. It was designed by American Walter Burley Griffin and opened in about 1914, 15 or 16. I saw a few dates. The Tatler, the Park Theatre, they were some of the names initially, but then finally in 1954 it became the Paris Theatre. So obviously in the early days they showed a lot of silent films, stage shows, and then Hoyts bought the site in 1952, refurbished it, and they had premieres there. There was one when they had Around the World in 80 Days where Elizabeth Taylor and Mike Todd apparently were in attendance. I know they were on a promotional visit at Mark Foy's in Sydney. As well, Star Wars premiered there and Mark Hamill supposedly made an appearance. And I think Doctor Who and the Daleks when the Circus of Oz was there. So yeah, very interesting. So Hoyts eventually abandoned the theatre early in 1977. They moved to the big George Street complex further downtown, and along came Johnny Allen. So look, he saw an opportunity. He was a fabulous visionary, and he did spend a year in America, in particular New York and San Francisco. And he did feel inspired to open up a multi-arts venue. So this is the first issue of Spurt Fanzine magazine. Ian Hartley was responsible for it. He edited the fanzine. There's an interview with Johnny Allen, and he says that the Paris was about people who wanted to get their trips together to explore things like music, cabaret theatre and magic. He mentions he loved the theatre for its design and futuristic vision. And he also wanted to bring out this museum of holography from New York and wanted to put an exhibition of Australian holograms there. And he didn't intend it just as a theatre. He wanted it to be a total art centre. He kind of was very interested in Australia being part of the whole world culture. He wanted Jim Sharman, Peter Weir, people like that to introduce films there. And interestingly, in the interview, he says that Australian groups weren't getting it together. You know, punk was about an energy exchange. New wave meant that, you know, it was an approach about, or it was how you approached your lifestyle or something like that. And he wanted the theatre to be like this protected space where you could just get up, be yourself, make a fool of yourself in front of your friends, and you didn't care. So yeah, he talked about how the Stone generation didn't really do a lot, whereas in New York they were more action sort of, oriented. So it went from screening movies like Sounds of Music to Word Is Out, the gay film, the punk film Blank Generation, and you kind of saw this new Sydney emerging where a lot more entertainment was available. Drag acts were popular in Sydney, Doris Fish, cabaret shows like Fifi L'Amour. The gay community started to really make an appearance in public. And yeah, I believe the films at the Paris actually may have inspired the first Mardi Gras parade. And in 1978, when it started, there were people actually being arrested in Sydney. And indeed, today they're called the 78ers, which they really wear with honour. So, Jim Sharman, Rex Cramphorn, Johnny Allen, Ian Hartley, Rick Rue, people that really contributed to the glory days of the Paris. Johnny and Jim actually put together a company, even though it's short-lived, called the Paris Theatre Company. I did want to focus more on the sort of musical side of things. And look, a lot of the gigs that took place kind of were booked by independent promoters or the bookers, the band bookers on a per gig basis. Johnny booked some of them, Rick Rue booked others. It was mostly free, and Ian Hartley says that if you were cool, you got a gig. Look, the few scattered flyers and posters from concerts do exist. There's some grainy footage and stills of bands, but largely the Paris Theatre as a music venue is mostly forgotten, sadly so. So a lot of bands played at the Paris Theatre, so I'll name quite a few of them. Agoraphobia, Babeez, News, Bedhogs, Black Runner, The Birthday Party, or The Boys Next Door, the Bushwhackers, Captain Matchbox, Crime City Solution, Cold Chisel played, I think, one gig there. Don Burrows, Flowers, In Excess, Jab, Jimmy and the Boys, Jojo Zeb, Laughing Clowns, Mangrove Boogie Kings, Margaret Road Night and Judy Bailey. So you can kind of see the mixture of, genres. Mental as Anything, Midnight Oil, Psychosurgeons, Press, Rocks, Rejex, Rose Tattoo, Shock Treatment, Simon and the Diamonds, The Screaming Abdabs, Society Blitz, Subversion, Survivors, Tommy and the Dipsticks, Wendy Saddington, XL Capri's, X-Ray Z, Wasted Days, The Thought Criminals, and I think World War IV as well. So look, the New Wave Concerts ads were how they were kind of advertised in the media. The Screaming Abdabs, the Press, and the Johnny Dole band, they had a review where apparently the place was packed. Money, food and shoes were being thrown on stage. Double J had their mobile truck there that night. So apparently they'd record bands like X and News and Rocks for their broadcasts on Wednesday nights. I was lucky enough to speak to Steve Lucas of the band X, and I saw them actually recently at the Petersham Bowling Club on their 40th anniversary tour, I think it was. Fantastic night. So let's take a listen to Steve. Of the Paris Theatre. What are your memories of it? I know it was a long time ago.
Well, Paris Theatre was where we did our second X gig. We did our first one at the Bondi Lifesaver, and then we got a call asking us if we wanted to play at the Paris Theatre with Cold Chisel and Rose Tattoo. Because we were on first, we were there pretty early. Mm-hmm. And all the punks were lining up, and Ian Cray and I went down and opened the side doors to let everyone in for free. I remember doing that. Wow. So we got as many as we could, and then the guitarist Ian Cray's amp blew up, which was not very good after about halfway through the set. And Steve Cafiero and Ian Ryland, who were kind of veterans by the time we had X together, they'd been in the industry separately for a good 10 years before we came along, and they were freaking out because they thought this is their second gig, these poor young kids, and the amp's blown up. But, Ian Cray and I, because we didn't know any better, we just said, oh, bugger it, and lit a couple of cigarettes and sat down on the stage and started talking to the people in the front row. Oh, wow. While roadies ran around getting everything working. Then when they said, yeah, it's all good, we hopped up and finished the set. Oh, wow. Which was pretty funny for us. And then Cold Chisel got on stage, and in their second or third song, their guitar amp blew up. Oh, wow. They just thought, oh, we better keep playing. So the drums and bass kept playing, and Jimmy Barnes kept going, there's someone knocking on the kitchen door for about, I don't know, felt like half an hour, but it's probably only 5 or 10 minutes. In retrospect, I thought we handled it a lot better as newbies than Cold Chisel. Yeah. Then Rose Tattoo came on, and it was, pretty wild by then. That was my first encounter with the Paris Theatre. Bruce Tyndale, he was at the time in the band Screaming Abdabs. He said that their first gig,
The small crowd seemed really surprised at their visual style. The second gig they had there was pretty scary as the audience would scream out obscenities and, throw things on stage at them. I did read some praise for Johnny Dole and the Scabs, in particular the drummer Greg Morris. As well, apparently Johnny looked good on the big stage, hanging off the microphone, and Greg actually said that they didn't play to too many people. And in fact, there's a current affair episode with Mike Carlton, who called the punks all, this strange and threatening species. So I could only find the audio though, not the visuals. And Greg actually says that punk really only kind of emerged after the band sort of showed up, which was a shame.
Although just how civilised we are is a question Mike Carlton asks when he takes a close look at punk rock.
Voice, he got a marvellous voice. He can sing nearly as good as Elvis.
Lead singer for Johnny Dole and the Scabs, the best known of Australia's punk rock bands. Isn't that enough to make any mum proud?
Well, I had hopes because when he was 14 he started.
This book is called Punk Miracle. It's by Johnny Rejex, and it says, the punk rock scene in Sydney in the 70s was like a riot on a roller coaster. Just the way it's about the crazy characters that, transformed Sydney from a quiet conservative city into the multicoloured cultural cauldron that it is today. He said that it was the best looking venue. It was a perfect atmosphere for a punk performance. It reminded him of vaudeville and burlesque. There's Johnny there. He remembers X playing there with one of the biggest inner city crowds that he had seen, and he recalls Johnny Dole and the Scabs playing a comeback gig there. So look, all these bands that played there between, say, 1977 and 1980, just had a great old time. The theatre did revert to kind of plays like Pandora's Cross, Visions, Boy's Own Macbeth, and A Season of Circus Oz. So it kind of went back to theatre, and Robin Archer's Songs from Sideshow Alley, I think, was the last one there. And look, the Paris was eventually demolished in 81 to make way for a residential apartment building, and it's that 28-storey Connaught building. So Clinton Walker's book, Inner City Sound, I've shown this before. It's got some great pictures of the bands that played there. You can see some of them there, like Black Runner, X, Shock Treatment, Johnny Dole. So some really cool pictures there. The Go-Betweens had their first show outside of Brisbane at the Paris Theatre, and I did read that Robert Foster of the band, he said that they headed there by train, didn't know anyone, sat in the darkness watching the other bands do their sound check, and after playing their gig, they just couldn't wait to go home to Brisbane. So look, that gig there with the Laughing Clowns and the Birthday Party is still being talked about today. Yeah, just a fantastic, triple bill. Memories. An 18-year-old Graham Bingham, he recalls a cold Sunday night in 1980 seeing the Bedhogs and Rejex. Stuart Crissell was a friend and in Bedhogs, and with Jim Atkins on vocals, he remembers how Jim dived off the stage, slid on the floor and moved like he was in a straitjacket, hugging the microphone. And when he was unleashed from the jacket, he'd fly to one side of the stage and then back again. Graham, also remembers that he felt weird walking into the empty lobby. It was really dark. There were rows of empty seats and only about 30 people standing in front of the stage, which he said was like shoulder height. As far as the fashion of the time, he had this skullet haircut, a purple long sleeve business shirt under a green and yellow crochet jumper with the elbows out and ripped jeans. And he also said that he remembers how nerve-wracking the train ride from Villawood into the city was, and how glad he was when Scar came along the following year. So there's an issue of Ram magazine where Anthony O'Grady describes the theatre. He said it was one of those old gingerbread kind of theatres, all guilt and nostalgia, the old days, and the emphasis now was more on a non-stop spectrum of alternative entertainment. There it is there. Rock films, jazz nights, poetry, experimental theatre, new wave music. It was all there. The fashion punks of Sydney kind of all came out. And the rock films sort of drew sizable crowds of respectful patrons, but the live entertainment Pulling power, he said, was more dicey. And on a recent New Wave night, the crowd, he said, was small, but swigging wine in the aisles and scattering butts under the seats. He said Mark Taylor from Psychosurgeons exchanged insults and blows with Carmel from Screaming Abdabs, and Johnny Dole berated the audience in now accepted punk fashion. It's a crazy mixed up kid, the sort of place you could just lob into and be entertained or be boggled by a night of tatty sleaze. It has its own excitement and charm. And that's from this 1977 December issue with Iggy on the cover. There is also another Ram issue that has a review of that triple bill that I mentioned earlier. Craig Pearce has a positive review of that. I'm not sure if you can see it. So that's also in a Ram magazine. There's a great picture of Ian Hartley sitting inside the Paris Theatre where he's selling tickets and he's smoking a cigarette. I love that picture. Bruce Tyndale answered an ad where they were having auditions at the Paris Theatre. There's an article dated February 1978 in the Sydney Morning Herald where they said punk rock shows are now typical in Sydney, and venues like the Bondi Lifesaver, the Grand and the Paris Theatre are the unofficial centres for punk rock. X were the favourites as far as bands. There were other bands like Mental as Anything, Johnny Dole and the Scabs, Crime and City Solution, World War IV. And the night that the journalist went, Jen Tabakoff, Black Runner were playing. It was $1.50 to get in, very loud. And by 8:30, the room was full of punk rockers. There were about 60 people there, spiky haircuts, razor earrings, torn jeans, people spitting cigarette butts onto the floor, and apparently applause was rare.
Isn't that enough to make any mum proud?
So Bob Short, he mentions that, the theatre was a fairly major spot post Funhouse down in Oxford Street. And he said the funniest gig was when the Boys Next Door and some other Suicide Records acts played there because, they were doing something where, the fans or the audience weren't happy, and, apparently they were greeted by a wall of beer cans. And probably the best gig that Bob saw was X playing in the foyer. And he thinks that every band really struggled in that main room there. The Psychosurgeons blew up Stan Armstrong's PA, and more memorable was the films that found their way to the screen. So films like The Blank Generation, which was shot with Super 8, and that mismatched audio kind of gave them their first glimpse of what the New York bands kind of look like. So, apparently the John Waters movies were really cool and the Andy Warhols weren't that great. Also, in New Year's Eve in 78, the Psychosurgeons played with a stolen gravestone on stage. There was a Suicide Records show with some Melbourne bands, and so a lot of people did go to the Paris Theatre, and I think Bob also mentioned the John Waters films and lewd sex acts in the back row were a highlight for him. So look, by, the beginning or the middle of the 80s, developers had their eyes on the site of the Paris Theatre. The city was changing. And look, like so many great venues around Sydney, the Paris simply just disappeared. It's a real shame because I just feel as though it was really quick and not enough people cared. The building was pulled down in 1981 and it made way for the apartment block called the Connaught Theatre. So a real shame. So look, I do have some advertisements that I wanted to show. This one here, you can see that ad, Jimmy and the Boys. There it is there. New Wave concerts. So some really cool Ram magazines. This one's showing Captain Matchbox and Jimmy and the Boys, as well as the Blank Generation movies. Books that you can buy. Lowbrow by Roger Grierson. They make reference to the Paris Theatre. This one by John Foy. Australia, A Punk History by Tristan Page. I think that is. Oh, no, sorry, Tristan Clark. And even Toby Zote's Punk Outsider. That's That's a real good book too, and it kind of talks about that whole scene. So whatever happened to the Paris Theatre doesn't exist. Yeah, memories for a lot of people. One of the reasons that I think it's important that a vlog like this shines a spotlight on this wonderful, beautiful old theatre that mostly, I guess, I have spoken about the music side of things, but of course it was known for more than that. So I hope you've enjoyed this vlog. Thanks for watching. If you've got any comments, if you've got any more stories about the Paris Theatre, write them down in the comment box, and I'd love to hear them. So don't forget to like and subscribe for more vlogs coming up that I'm sure will interest you. Cheers. The Paris Theatre and Blondies kind of didn't care. Anyone could turn up and play. And yeah, so it does kind of, you know, confirm how important venues like the Paris Theatre were in that sort of whole period of emerging, you know, punk rock and roll in Australia.